the US and California have fallen far behind the rest of the world in infrastructure investments. Please welcome Senator Jim Bell.
Thank you, Norm. Let me give you some numbers. The state estimates that we're currently at a $59 billion backlog in maintenance in the state highway system, and that is growing by $4 billion a year. Cities and counties have an equally staggering $78 billion backlog for local streets and roads. Governor Brown believes this is such an important challenge that he has convened in the last 2 weeks a special session of the state legislature to address this specific issue.
The gas tax has not been raised since 1993, and it was not indexed to inflation. So when you look at the big picture, I want to say the gas tax receipts generate about $34 billion a year, but the federal government is spending $50 billion a year. Congress couldn't figure out how to even find funding for an 8-month bill to get us to the end of the year, which would have been about $8 to $9 billion. So they're having trouble, I would say. And one thing I meant to note is that when you look at funding for a 6-year bill, simply at current levels, so not expanding any new programs, they need to find about $100 billion outside of what is generated in the Highway Trust Fund.
Some of the numbers in California, we have $57 billion hole relative to deferred maintenance of our current system of 50,000 highway miles and 15,000 bridges. We rank 45th out of 50 states for overall highway performance. We have a 10-year funding shortfall in transportation needs of $296 billion, and 58% of California's roadways require rehabilitation. It only gets worse with the statistics, so you look distressed enough. I'm going to stop there because I really want to make sure I have time to now make you depressed. The gasoline tax in California hasn't increased since the early 1990s, and it is now worth half the purchasing power that it once was. We celebrate, as we should, more fuel-efficient vehicles or completely all-electric vehicles, and those of us who are concerned about climate change and greenhouse gas emissions should celebrate that. Yet at the same time, the irony is we have not yet figured out a way to make sure that we are all contributing to the transportation systems that we need as we make that change. And therefore, we have less money because our cars are more efficient. And then finally, as you heard from Senator Bell, we continue, sadly, at the state level to divert funding sources intended for transportation for non-transportation purposes, including the roughly $975 million we'll lose this year because of the diversion of the truck weight fees.
What I would suggest we do is keep reframing the issue as an investment in the economy. George Stephanopoulos once said it's the economy stupid. I mean, to describe what's at stake here. And that's what's at stake in infrastructure over and over again. We need to go as citizens to Congress and say this problem needs to be fixed. It's not a Democrat, Republican problem. It's not a tax. It's a fee. And we need to make the investment. And it's going to take people like you not to contact the California delegation because they're really not the problem, I think. But business, perhaps, to stand up and talk to the Republicans, and then, you know, let's move on. Thank you.
Wow. And as Asha's research demonstrates, essentially we've got a bunch of elected officials who think it is their mission to protect us from our own darker impulses that suggest that we might be willing to pay higher taxes. Let me read you a quotation from a very prominent member of that priesthood. So I want to make it clear, I'm against raising the gas tax. There's not much happening in this economy to help it grow, but lower gas prices is one of them. Working families have been struggling for years to get by. They've looked high and low for good-paying jobs. Their paychecks haven't grown much at all, and now they're finally catching a break. It would be downright unfair to take that away from them. So we are not raising gas taxes, plain and simple. So I think we're all used to politicians telling us they can't raise gas taxes when the prices are high, right? Because the motorists are already suffering. Now we've got, and I think this is like a minor masterpiece of political rhetoric, we've got the opposite argument. We can't raise taxes when prices are low, because then we'd be taking the savings that the motorist is enjoying away from them. So the moral of the story is, when is the best time to raise the gas tax? Never. That's Paul Ryan, by the way, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who's the guy who has to raise taxes if we're ever able to pull it off. So I think we're stymied in Washington. I agree. And when you look at the alternative, which is this notion that we're going to rely on corporate tax reform to fund our long-term infrastructure needs, you know, they're going to put a number attached to that initiative and say, there's your money. And do you know how good corporate America is at avoiding paying taxes? Do you know how rotten whatever revenue estimate they give us will be? And we're going to trust our long-term infrastructure expansion on that revenue stream. Earl Blumenauer, Grace's old congressman, has this saying that, you know, no great civilization ever built its infrastructure, you know, 1 6-month bill at a time. But that is exactly the place we're in. We've had 24 extensions of the last long-term bill we ever had, and I'm not sure we're going to have one again in Washington, quite frankly. One idea I've had, and I've had some modest success getting people interested in it in Washington, given where we are, we almost need a gas tax that raises itself, right? Now, one way of doing that is to index the tax, but that requires you to vote for indexing the tax. Another way to do it would be to convert the excise tax, which is killing us because people are driving fewer miles, to a sales tax on fuel. And you could do it at a revenue-neutral basis to start with, so that the Republican priesthood could say with a straight face, we are not raising taxes. But over time, if you want to bet on higher oil prices, and I probably would, you're going to raise more revenue. Now, you're also going to take the downside risk when the rate goes down, but over time, I think you're probably going to see some advantages. I think Carl's got his finger on the right answer, though, and as he said, it's not necessarily the desirable answer, but I'm afraid it's the necessary one, and that is when someone in charge will not lead, follow, or get out of the way, you've got to work around them. And I think that's what we've been doing in California for 30 or 40 years now. I think a lot of other states are jumping onto that bandwagon, and I think more and more of them will. Unfortunately, that means we're going to have a state-by-state, community-by-community response to this issue, and it does have downsides. I mean, here in the Bay Area, we are extremely fortunate that our voters are not only so noisy about traffic, but they're willing to put their money where their mouths are. And they have raised gas taxes, they've raised bridge tolls, they've raised sales taxes, they've raised BART property. I mean, you name it, they have raised taxes to fix stuff. That's good for the Bay Area. What about Shasta, and what about Tehama County? What about rural California, where there is neither the tax base nor the inclination to do it, and they are basically left out in the cold? So the self-help movement is not an unalloyed success for everybody, and what it leaves out is the notion that we're all in this together, and that infrastructure, especially transportation infrastructure, it's a network utility. You need to deal with it as a network and not just improve it in places where their citizens are wealthy and are willing to part with some of their revenue. So I've probably run the risk of doing what Carl did and trying to depress you. But I will say in conclusion that what we ought to also do is praise people like Jim Bell, who are willing to stick their neck out, and in his case, it's a pretty big neck, who are willing to stick their neck out and worry more about doing their job than keeping their job.
Today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club is adjourned.